Hello, and thank you for clicking and logging on to the video. I'm glad you found us, and hopefully it's going to help you and your colleagues with being better teachers. Basically, before I go on to what we're looking at today, I just want to tell you a little bit about this series, as this is one of the first videos in our series. And the History How-Tos, it's a project designed basically to both share and model approaches to teaching and learning, which have been highlighted to us by other members of the history teacher community. The idea is that these have been picked out as being capable of improving the historical understanding of your students, whilst at the same time making your life easier to be a more effective practitioner. All of the videos in the series and all of the guide sheets have been produced by teachers with the aim of sharing and benefiting other teachers. So this video is going to be all about an approach called the Frayer model. Now, I'm just going to, before I move any further, just want to draw your attention to the document, the guide sheet that you're going to be able to access as well. It's linked below, and you can find it on a blog, which I'll share with you at the end of this video. But this is what the guide sheet looks like. We are producing these for each of the videos that we are creating for you, so you can go back to these, make use of these, and it also saves you taking any notes whilst you're watching, which is obviously a good thing, saving us time and improving your effectiveness. So as far as Frayer models, what's the idea of it? Well, basically, I'm now in my 14th year of teaching, and what has become increasingly apparent to me through my reading and through my research is that effectively several of my students over those 14 years have failed to progress due to a language barrier. Essentially, they haven't understood a significant number of the words I've used, and that has prevented them from fulfilling their potential. And the Education Endowment Foundation, very superb group to read up on and read their reports in full if you have the time. But this was the main takeaway for me, that by attending to language demands of your subject, you increase your students' chances of success in your subject. We need to unlock our students' capability of engaging with what it is that we want them to understand, develop, and begin to use for themselves. So in terms of how to find a solution to this, well, as a parent of young children, I'm a big believer in reading being the answer of every educational ill. So I looked into reading, and another video you're going to get a chance to see, and how to unguided reading by Simon Beale was at the centre of my approach to using reading within a lesson. But that in itself highlighted some real issues and problems with that approach. For example, when tricky words came up, students were unable to connect with them in the way that I wanted. This could be for two different reasons. Could be because the words themselves were familiar in a way that they switched off because they felt, I understand what that word means. When in fact, it turns out that they have a misconception or they're misapplying the word. There's also the problem of a word being unfamiliar, but the students not wanting to admit it. So claiming that they understand, not wanting to stick their head above the parapet, as it were, around their peers, etc. Ultimately leading to a situation where a clear barrier to learning is being hidden from our understanding as teachers. And that's something that I want to end. I looked at using a glossary. I still use those, but I have recognised now the importance of going through the words in advance to prevent the rhythm of the language of the reading being disrupted and actually preventing their own enjoyment of the reading process. So in terms of what to do about it, I reflected on key educational principles, such as that which Mark Enser puts forward: recap, input, apply, test and respond. I need a method with language to be able to recap on what language has been instructed before, to input new language, to have them apply that language, and to test and respond to the outcomes of those tests of their understanding of the word or concept that I'm keen to embed in their historical learning. So I turned to a fantastic writer on this subject, Alex Quigley, and his book, The Closing the Vocabulary Gap. I highly, highly recommend it. It's full of fantastic ideas, but the one in particular which stood out and I wanted to investigate further, also with the help of his excellent blog, The Confident Teacher, was this, called the Frayer model. Now, the Frayer model has been around for a long time. I'm not claiming any ownership of it. It is something which has been shared with me and that I have really embedded in my practice and seen the benefit of, which after all is what How to History is all about. It's based on a structure which students can easily become familiar with, and the repetition of that structure aids the students in acquiring and using accurately new historical disciplinary language. So to start with an example for you here, this is an example of a new word, use up. The only time I'd come across use up in my own reading and my own study at school was Henry VII, and in many cases this is where most people will come across the word, having never experienced it before. So in terms of how the box works, first of all, it's crucial that you have a definition which students can understand. In this case, seizure of power from a legitimate leader or group. Now, the word within that, incidentally, which may cause some problems, is legitimate. That, of course, is historical language in this sense. No cause to panic. In fact, make sure that you've made a Frayer model for legitimate and have used that either before you introduce usurp or perhaps in a previous lesson if you feel it relevant. You'll also notice I've added in there a bit of the etymology, where this word comes from. I felt it was relevant. I've used a smaller font so as to distinguish it from the main definition. That isn't an essential part of the Frayer model, but it is something that you might wish to include. In this case, the Latin being seized for use, I think it's interesting for the students to know where that's come from. And as with anything, if there's a story to it, they are going to be able to grasp that all the more better. The second box, which always has to be part of your Frayer model, is characteristics or key features, as it were. This is crucial because this is what the characteristics that can be recognised as fitting the definition of usurp. Leaders who usurp power don't ask for permission to take control of their country. The idea that they commonly use force, often with the support of a large army. Notice as well that I'm actually writing these as sentences rather than just pithy bullet points. That's important because if we're trying to model use of good language, it is important that we write using correct grammar and semantics, as you can see here. So those two elements have to be in there. Arguably the most important is the third element, examples. Now, I strongly urge where possible that one of the examples you use to demonstrate the word is an example that the students have come across before. That, of course, might mean some tweaking, some changing of a previous teacher or a colleague who you've magpied Frayer models off on Twitter, more about that later, and you might want to adjust it or adapt it to fit with what your students have learnt before. So in this case, I know that my students, I use this with Year 12 this year, I know that during GCSE they looked at Saxons and Normans, so they're familiar with William the Conqueror. So William I, 1066, is a clear example of usurpation. He wasn't recognised by the Witan as the legitimate leader of England, but he took power, in this case, by force. Okay, and then I've gone on to perhaps foreshadow in this case by having Henry Tudor as part of the examples, as that was the individual we were coming on to talk about. The fourth box, this is where you can use a bit of your own teacher intuition and use your own experience. From my experience using the Frayer model, I highly recommend where possible use non-examples. That could be, if it's a more tier 2 word, that could be using an antonym to show the opposite of the word itself, or in this historical sense, I'm picking out examples from history which have a similarity to usurp, but with a crucial difference. So whereas like Henry VII, Henry VIII takes over as king, it's not a usurpation because he is recognised as the legitimate heir to the throne. Similarly, Charles II is invited to return as the monarchy is restored. It isn't taking control by force without permission. As the final aspect that I've brought in there, which may be something you want to consider, is word family. Now, the definition in this case and the word family, I took both of those from the superbvocabulary.com. I highly recommend having a look at that, as it's extremely good, aimed at educators for being able to pick out effective definitions and a bit about the types of words that are related to the one you're using. And as is, well, I won't say a fad, because a fad suggests something that isn't going to carry on, and this is something which is definitely enhancing education, is the use of dual coding. And you can see here, I've used a fantastic icon. I was very excited that there was a usurp icon. Again, the icons that I use, many of them, not all, but many of them are from another excellent website called the Noun Project, which if you haven't been familiar with, go to that and make the most of it. So usurp is an example of picking out a word, in this case a tier 2 word, which students are likely to be unfamiliar with, and introducing them to it in a comfortable, structured way. Another example of where the Frayer model comes into its own is if you're using a word that they might be familiar with but has a different meaning in history, subject specific. If they have been studying biology, they may have come across the word colony as meaning a group of organisms of the same type living or growing together. Now, that's completely different, of course, to the explanation and definition that we want them to consider in history. So the Frayer model comes into its own with the opportunity to be distinct and specific as to what this means in history. Again, characteristics. The non-examples chosen should include ideally some of the characteristics, because then you're able to really be clear on the specifics of not only what that word is, but what that word isn't. Another example of this would be tribute. A classic example of a word which may well be familiar to students, but in a context which is not the same as we want them to consider it in history. For example, where they will most have come across tribute will be paying tribute to somebody who has achieved something fantastic, or paying tribute to somebody who has sadly passed away. Well, in that case, if they take that prior knowledge and without explaining the use of the word in advance, you then talk about King Ethelred paying tribute to the Vikings to make them go away. Well, that doesn't make sense. Why are they paying tribute to the Vikings? Does Ethelred the Unready like the Vikings? It immediately leads students down a road of misunderstanding, which is quite hard to get them back from. Preempt that by dealing with the language before you start embedding it in the narrative itself. So, two really valuable uses of the Frayer model there. That's not the end of it. One of the most powerful ways of using it is to demonstrate nuance. This can be by using two Frayer models in quick succession to demonstrate to students what are the differences between that word or concept. That could be an obvious example, like perhaps taking communism and capitalism, or autocracy and democracy. But in this case, I'm going to pick one that is really commonly misunderstood by many ordinary people, and as well as our students. And if, Fred Blogs on the street doesn't understand it, we need to make sure that we are allowing our students to see nuance. In this case, patriotism. Patriotism inspired by love for your country. You can see again I've brought a bit of etymology in there. By contrast, nationalism is a belief that your country is better than all others. A clear difference. Nationalism is about superiority. It can motivate a desire to break away from working with others, seeing other countries and institutions as beneath your own, which is very different to patriotism, which is celebrating the role of your country in the world. And you can see with nationalism, I've put a non-example of globalism, of internationalism. Really good way of clearly showing the nuance between two words which can commonly be taken to mean the same thing. Now, with any of this, once you've been through this process, it is absolutely crucial that you use it. Because, for example, if you're bringing a word like dolstos, very complicated, a new word, one which is commonly misunderstood, perhaps confused with diktat is a common error that my students make. It's important that we look at what can we do to make sure that our students are understanding that word better. Now, in this case, rather than go with a non-example, I decided to use that box to offer a counter to the whole concept of dolstos. So in this case, if the meaning of dolstos, which is only applicable to one situation, the counter is the argument against what dolstos is putting forward. I've kept 3 of the boxes the same, but I've changed a third. But crucially, with dolstos, with tribute, whatever the word is that you are introducing students to, you need them to apply it to get used to it. Use the concept of interleaving. The first stage I would strongly recommend is get them, having been introduced to the word first of all, to write a sentence using that word. That doesn't have to be a historical sentence. Don't add that extra pressure on. This isn't about knowledge retrieval. Given their new, hopefully, understanding of the word, can they write a sentence using it accurately? That gives you the opportunity to have a look at what they've written. If you're like me and you value using a visualizer, take a couple of examples from students, stick it under the visualizer, celebrate that, and imbue with confidence those students that they've just managed to get their head round in a short space of time a challenging word or challenging concept. It can be really liberating in the classroom to highlight that achievement collectively. Furthermore, later on in the lesson, I would recommend in that lesson or maybe a subsequent lesson or a subsequent task, model using that word in some historical writing. Live model it yourself and commentate, narrate, make clear to the students why you're choosing that word, why it fits, why have you chosen to include that there. You can then go on perhaps to set some challenge tasks where when the students are completing some writing themselves, you give them 2 or 3 words that they will get extra credit for if they include in their paragraph of writing. You can use the Frayer model as a means of retrieval, perhaps a starter activity for a lesson the next week or 4 weeks after or 2 months after. They need to fill in part of the Frayer model which is missing. There's lots of different opportunities to use the model, but as hopefully you get the message of, you can't expect that just from going through the Frayer model once, that word is going to be cemented in the child's vocabulary. It's unrealistic to expect that, and it's a misunderstanding of the method of the Frayer. I use the Frayer models as a glossary. I create booklets in how I teach and how we run things in my department, and at the back of the booklet is the different Frayer models with some space next to it for the students to complete their sentences using the Frayer model word accurately. That's the way that I like to use it, and it gives the students an easy chance to go to their glossary when they need to refresh their memory of what a particular word means. Now, I don't want to leave you on your own with this. If you go to my Twitter, and you can see my Twitter handles at the top of the picture, and also I'll share it with you in a moment. But if you go to my Twitter, go to Pin Tweets, you'll find that I've got a link there to a folder filled now with well over 100 different words which have been given the Frayer model treatment. So please download those, adapt those to fit with your own approach, and by all means, as many teachers have done already, which has been great to see, if you want to make your own and submit them to be included in the collection, that will obviously help, as is the whole idea of this how-to series. That will help other teachers and save them time whilst being more effective practitioners. Finally, to reflect briefly on the whole how-to series, there are going to be several more examples of these videos for you to make use of. If I could just move my floating head out of the way there. The place to find your documents, I'll hyperlink to this in the explanation beneath the video on YouTube, but Mr. Thornton Teach is where you'll find the PDFs of the document, the how-to guides, and the YouTube channel, which hopefully you found your way to because you are here now. The YouTube channel where all these video explainers will go on is His TV, and there's lots of other stuff there on that channel, more specific to the subject, teachers delivering their own mini lessons on different topics that hopefully you can make use of, save yourself time and improve your student understanding of key elements of history. Hopefully you found that useful. I really would appreciate any feedback, ideally positive, but even better, constructive, in the comments, or send me a message on Twitter, and I'll be happy to help you and respond. Thank you.